So licensing came in with the Housing Act 2004, which confusingly enough came into force in 2006, but don't worry too much about that. So there was a grace period, so they allowed landlords to get their applications in. But the first form of licensing was mandatory licensing. This was a requirement for larger HMOs, shared rental accommodation, to be required to have a license across the board. So all larger HMOs had to have a license, and this came in both England and Wales. And this brought it into line with Scotland, which had actually had licensing in for years already, and had had quite a lot of success with it. And so what the licensing did was it gave a few benefits. It had a minimum standard for levels of management of the property. So we're talking about the business practices of the manager. So not what you see in the management regulations. This was more about how they operated. So they had to carry out periodic inspections of the property. They had to have all the appropriate certification for checks on the property. They would have to deal with antisocial behaviour as and when it arose at the property, and minimum repair times were agreed in the licence conditions, and all of these things were brought in with licensing conditions. Another thing that was brought in with licensing conditions were minimum levels of amenities. So what do I mean by amenities? Well, amenities were in your house are your bathroom, your kitchen, any extraction fans you've got in the house, any levels of fire protection that you've got within the property, like fire alarms. All of these come under amenity standards, which are put in licenses. And so if you were a tenant that was entering one of these larger HMOs, the idea was that the use of mandatory licensing and lists of local authority conditions imposed upon those licenses, and the local authorities could impose whichever conditions they wanted pretty much, it meant that you could guarantee that when you opened the front door of whichever rental accommodation you moved into, as long as it had gone through licensing, you could be sure that you were going to get some basics, basically a good level of conduct from the people managing the property, and that you would have certain minimum levels of amenity provision, including fire safety. Two other benefits of this property licensing was it allowed the local authorities to impose a fit and proper person standard on anybody that's to be involved with the management of these properties. This means that if you're going to be involved in managing that accommodation, then you have to be free of criminal convictions and such like that. Might mean that you are an inappropriate person to look after rental accommodation, particularly the type of rental accommodation where you're likely to get the poorest occupiers in society and the most vulnerable people. Finally, the licensing allowed the local authorities to impose a fee at their discretion for the cost of administering the process of licensing the landlords, so property inspections, Disclosure Scotland checks, dealing with paperwork, service of legal notices, that sort of thing. And then an additional fee could be imposed on each of the applicants to cover the broad costs of managing the scheme and administering it. And so this might be costs for searching for properties that where the landlords have tried to avoid licensing and carrying out enforcement action against them, but also going in and inspecting properties during the license in order to ensure that they fulfill the minimum criteria set out in the license conditions, and then carrying out legal action if they didn't. There are a variety of other things that come alongside licensing schemes, and the idea of licensing is it's to drive improvement across the board in an area, and so the Housing Act 2004 allowed local authorities to move beyond just licensing large HMOs, and if they wanted to, the local authorities could bring in extra licensing schemes in their area to focus on either smaller HMOs, so that'd be additional licensing, or any singly occupied properties they've got in their area, which will be selective licensing. I'll talk more about those later on. And so if the local authority wanted to bring in these two different types of extra licensing in their area, then they had to do some public consultation, but they could bring it in if they were trying to address specific problems, like you've got an area of poorly managed student accommodation, for instance, or you've got an area where you've got low demand for singly occupied housing and quite high levels of antisocial behaviour. And as part of a package of measures, the licensing can work to help local authorities to coordinate their activities, bringing in a load of other stakeholders like the police, the fire brigade, the antisocial behaviour team, waste and street scene services that deal with poor waste provision, waste presentation, and accumulations of household rubbish, all sorts of things, in order to try to address problems with an area and to drive up improvement. So drive the improvement of areas where you've got high densities of rental accommodation.